Sarah Martinez had always been careful about her safety. As a 28-year-old graphic designer living in downtown Seattle, she knew the importance of being aware of her surroundings. But nothing could have prepared her for what started as innocent compliments from and escalated into a living nightmare. It began 6 months ago when joined her marketing firm as a new account manager. At first, Sarah thought he was just being friendly, would bring her coffee in the morning, compliment her work, and find excuses to stop by her desk. Sarah was polite but kept their interactions professional. She was focused on her career and wasn't interested in workplace romance. Was a tall man in his early 30s with an intense stare that made Sarah uncomfortable. He had a way of standing too close when he talked to her, and his compliments felt more like observations than casual remarks. "You always wear that blue sweater on Wednesdays," he would say, or "I noticed you take the same route to the parking garage every evening." Sarah initially brushed off these comments as awkward attempts at conversation. But as weeks passed, his behavior became increasingly intrusive. He would show up at the coffee shop she frequented before work, claiming it was a coincidence. He knew details about her life that she had never shared with him, like her favorite bookstore and the yoga class she attended on Saturday mornings. The first real warning sign came when Sarah found a bouquet of red roses on her car windshield with a note that read, "For the most beautiful woman in the world. You don't know how much you mean to me." There was no signature, but Sarah immediately suspected. When she confronted him at work the next day, he any involvement but had a satisfied smile that made her skin crawl. Sarah decided to document everything. She started keeping a journal of his behavior, taking screenshots of his excessive text messages, and saving the gifts that appeared mysteriously at her apartment door. Her friends advised her to report him to HR, but Sarah worried about creating workplace drama over what might be considered harmless admiration. The situation escalated when began following her home. Sarah would notice his silver Civic several cars behind her on her evening commute. At first, she told herself it was paranoia, but the pattern became undeniable. He knew her schedule better than some of her closest friends did. One rainy Thursday evening, Sarah decided to test her suspicions. Instead of taking her usual route home, she made several random turns through residential neighborhoods. His car followed every turn. When Sarah pulled into a 24-hour grocery store parking lot, drove past but circled back and parked across the street. Sarah sat in her car for 20 minutes watching him watch her before finally calling the police. Officer Jennifer responded to Sarah's call and took her statement seriously. She explained that whilst behavior was concerning, they needed more concrete evidence of stalking to take legal action. Officer advised Sarah to be extra cautious and to call immediately if approached her directly or made any threats. The next day at work acted as if nothing had happened. He was his usual overly friendly self, but Sarah noticed how his eyes followed her movements around the office. During lunch, her Maria pulled her aside with troubling news. "Sarah, I need to tell you something about," Maria whispered, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "I was talking to someone from his previous job, and they said he had problems there too. Apparently, there was a woman in accounting who had to get a restraining order against him." Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't just awkward workplace behavior, had a history of stalking. She immediately scheduled a meeting with HR Director Johnson to discuss the situation. Was sympathetic but explained that since hadn't directly threatened Sarah or violated any company policies at work, their options were limited. However, she agreed to document the complaint and promised to monitor the situation closely. That weekend, Sarah decided to stay with her sister Emma in Bellevue to get some distance from the situation. She didn't tell anyone at work about her plans, yet somehow knew. On Saturday morning, Sarah received a text message from an unknown number. "Staying with your sister won't keep you safe. I know where you are." Sarah's hands shook as she showed the message to Emma. Her sister immediately insisted they call the police. This time, the evidence was clear enough for Detective Robert to take immediate action. The threatening text message, combined with Sarah's documented history of stalking behavior, was sufficient grounds for the police to pay a visit. When Detective and his partner arrived at his apartment, they discovered a disturbing shrine dedicated to Sarah. The walls were covered with photographs of her taken without her knowledge, pictures of her leaving work, shopping for groceries, walking her dog, and even some taken through her apartment window. There were printed copies of her social media posts, her work schedule that he had somehow obtained, and detailed notes about her daily routines. Was arrested on charges of stalking and criminal harassment. But as he was being led away in handcuffs, he turned to Detective and spoke words that would haunt Sarah for months to come. "You can arrest me, but you can't protect her forever. She belongs to me and I always get what's mine. She'll never escape me, no matter where she goes or who she thinks can help her." The legal proceedings moved slowly. Was released on bail with a restraining order that prohibited him from contacting Sarah or coming within 500 feet of her home or workplace. But Sarah knew that a piece of paper wouldn't stop someone as obsessed as had proven to be. Sarah's sense of security was completely shattered. She installed a security system in her apartment, changed her phone number, and varied her daily routines. She couldn't concentrate at work, jumped at every unexpected sound, and found herself constantly looking over her shoulder. Sleep became elusive, and she lost weight from the constant stress. 2 weeks after his arrest, Sarah began receiving anonymous gifts again. Flowers would appear at her door with notes saying things like "soon" and "I'm watching." The police suspected was violating his restraining order, but they couldn't prove he was the one leaving the gifts. Sarah's breaking point came when she found a photograph slipped under her apartment door. It was a picture of her sleeping, taken through her bedroom window. On the back, someone had written, "You look so peaceful when you sleep. I can't wait to be closer to you." That night, Sarah packed a bag and checked into a hotel. She called Detective, who arranged for increased patrol coverage in her neighborhood, but he admitted that was being clever about avoiding detection. The stalking continued, but now it felt more dangerous and unpredictable. During this terrifying period, Sarah found solace in an unlikely place. She had started attending a support group for stalking victims, hopping to find coping strategies and emotional support. The group met every Tuesday evening at a community center downtown, facilitated by a counselor named Dr. Torres. It was at one of these sessions that Sarah first noticed Adrian Blackwood. He was tall and elegantly dressed, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see everything. Adrian rarely spoke during group discussions, but when he did, his voice was calm and commanding. There was something mysterious about him that both intrigued and comforted Sarah. Adrian had mentioned that he was also dealing with security issues related to his business, though he never went into detail about the nature of those problems. He owned several nightclubs in the city and seemed to have connections throughout Seattle's business community. Despite the group's rule about not pursuing romantic relationships with fellow members, Sarah found herself drawn to Adrian's quiet strength and protective presence. After several weeks of exchanged glances and brief conversations after group sessions, Adrian approached Sarah in the parking lot one evening. "I couldn't help but notice that you seem particularly troubled lately," he said, his voice gentle but concerned. "Is your situation getting worse?" Sarah hesitated, then found herself telling Adrian about the escalating harassment and her growing fear that would eventually find a way to hurt her despite the restraining order. Adrian listened intently, his expression growing darker as she described threats and the evidence of his continued surveillance. "Sarah, I want you to know that you don't have to face this alone," Adrian said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her feel both vulnerable and protected. "I have resources and connections that might be able to help in ways that traditional law enforcement cannot." There was something in Adrian's tone that suggested he was offering more than just moral support or business connections. Sarah sensed that he was a man who was accustomed to solving problems permanently, though she couldn't quite understand what made her think that. "I appreciate the offer," Sarah replied, "but I don't want to drag anyone else into this mess. Has already proven that he's unstable and potentially dangerous." Adrian stepped closer, and Sarah caught a hint of an expensive cologne mixed with something else she couldn't identify. "Some people need to learn that there are consequences for their actions," he said quietly, "and some of us are better equipped to teach those lessons than others." Before Sarah could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, Adrian handed her a business card with just his name and a phone number. "If things get worse, and I suspect they will, call me immediately. Day or night, I'll answer." Sarah looked down at the simple black card, then back up to thank Adrian, but he had already disappeared into the shadows of the parking lot. She stood there for a moment, wondering how he had moved so quickly and quietly before getting into her car and driving back to her hotel. That night, Sarah lay in bed thinking about Adrian's offer and the strange sense of power and danger that seemed to surround him. She had learned to trust her instincts over the past few months, and something about Adrian felt different from anyone she had ever met. He radiated a confidence and capability that made her believe he could actually do something about when the police and legal system had failed to stop him. Meanwhile, across the city was planning his next move. The restraining order and arrest had only made him more determined to possess Sarah. In his twisted mind, her rejection and the legal consequences only proved how special and valuable she was. He had been careful since his release from jail, using intermediaries to deliver gifts and hearing people to watch her without directly violating the terms of his bail. Had quit his job at the marketing firm, but he had saved enough money to focus entirely on his obsession with Sarah. He rented a small apartment with a view of Sarah's building and spent hours each day watching her movements through binoculars. He had also been researching Sarah's background, looking for weaknesses or pressure points he could exploit. What didn't know was that he had attracted the attention of someone far more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. Adrian Blackwood was not the ordinary businessman he appeared to be in the support group. He was something much older and infinitely more powerful, and he had developed a protective interest in Sarah that went beyond normal human attraction. Adrian had been attending the stalking support group not as a victim, but as someone who was studying the psychology of predators and their prey. His presence there was part of a larger investigation into criminal behavior patterns in the city, though his methods of dealing with criminals were far more permanent than anything the conventional justice system offered. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine Sarah's fate and teach that some prey come with protectors who don't play by human rules. Sarah's nightmare was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted, least of all, who had no idea that his threats had been overheard by someone who viewed them as a personal challenge. As Sarah finally drifted off to sleep in her hotel room, clutching Adrian's business card, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. The nightmare that had begun with obsessive attention was about to transform into something entirely different, and Sarah would soon learn that sometimes the most unlikely salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. The quiet war for Sarah's freedom was about to begin, fought between a human monster who believed he owned her and a protector whose true nature was more terrifying than worst nightmares. And in the end, only one of them would walk away from the confrontation that was rapidly approaching. Sarah's fragile sense of security shattered completely when she returned to her apartment 3 days later. The locks had been changed by her landlord as a precaution, but somehow had still managed to get inside. Her living room was destroyed, furniture overturned, pictures smashed, and personal items scattered everywhere. But the most chilling discovery was in her bedroom, where it left a message written in red lipstick across her mirror. "Coming home soon, my love." Detective arrived within minutes of Sarah's frantic call, his face grim as he surveyed the destruction. "This is a clear violation of his restraining order," he told Sarah as crime scene technicians photographed the damage. "We'll issue a warrant for his arrest immediately." But it vanished. His apartment was empty, his car was gone, and he had withdrawn all his money from his bank accounts before disappearing. The police put out a BOLO alert, but had planned his final phase carefully. He was no longer just stalking Sarah, he was preparing to take her. Sarah couldn't return to her apartment. The violation of her personal space felt like a physical assault, and she knew would be watching for her return. She checked into a different hotel across town, using cash and registering under a false name, but even then she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. On Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after the break-in, Sarah's new phone rang. She had only given the number to her sister, detective, and her boss. Her heart pounded as she answered, expecting to hear his voice making new threats. Instead, she heard Adrian Blackwood's calm, measured tone. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind that I tracked down your new number. I was concerned when you didn't show up to group this week." "How did you get this number?" Sarah asked, though she felt relief rather than alarm at hearing from him. "I have certain resources," Adrian replied diplomatically. "More importantly, I've been keeping track of your situation through my connections in the police department. Detective is a good man, but he's limited by procedures and laws that don't apply to people like your stalker." Sarah sank onto her hotel bed, suddenly exhausted by the constant fear and vigilance. "Broke into my apartment. The police think he's planning something bigger, but they can't find him. I feel like I'm trapped in some horrible game where he makes all the rules." "That's because you've been playing by the wrong rules," Adrian said, his voice taking on a harder edge. Men like only understand one language, and it's not legal documents or police warnings. There was something in Adrian's tone that made Sarah sit up. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you let me handle this situation in a way that will ensure never bothers you or anyone else again, Adrian replied. But I need you to trust me completely, and you need to be prepared for this to be resolved permanently. Sarah's rational mind told her to hang up and call detective, but her exhausted spirit yearned for someone who could actually end her nightmare. What would you need me to do? First, I need you to come stay at my house tonight. I have security measures in place that will keep you completely safe while I locate. Second, I need you to understand that once I handle this situation will never be a problem for you again. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Sarah understood perfectly, though she couldn't quite believe she was considering it. Are you talking about killing him? I'm talking about justice, Adrian replied. The kind that our legal system is too civilized to provide. That evening, Adrian picked Sarah up from her hotel in a black sedan with tinted windows. He was dressed in an expensive dark suit that made him look even more imposing than usual, and Sarah noticed that his driver was a large, serious-looking man who kept glancing in the mirror as if expecting trouble. Adrian's house was not what Sarah had expected. Instead of a typical Seattle residence, it was a sprawling estate in the hills overlooking the city, surrounded by high walls and sophisticated security systems. The house itself was elegant but felt ancient, with dark wood paneling, antique furniture, and artwork that looked centuries old. How long have you lived here? Sarah asked as Adrian led her through rooms filled with beautiful but somehow unsettling objects. Longer than you might imagine, Adrian replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. My family has owned this property for many generations. Sarah's guest room was luxurious and comfortable, with a fireplace, a sitting area, and windows that offered a stunning view of the city lights below. But she also noticed that the windows were fitted with heavy security bars disguised as decorative metalwork, and the door had multiple locks that could be controlled from both inside and outside the room. Am I a guest or a prisoner? Sarah asked, only half joking. You're under my protection, Adrian replied seriously, which means that nothing and no one can harm you while you're in this house, but it also means that certain precautions are necessary for your safety. That night, Sarah lay in the comfortable bed listening to sounds she couldn't identify echoing through the large house. There were voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize, footsteps that seemed too light and quick to be normal, and occasional sounds that reminded her of large animals moving through the corridors. Despite her unease, Sarah slept more deeply than she had in weeks. She woke the next morning feeling rested for the first time since harassment had begun. Adrian was waiting for her in an elegant dining room with breakfast already prepared, fresh fruit, pastries, and coffee that was better than anything she had ever tasted. I have news about, Adrian said as Sarah ate. My people located him last night. He's been staying in an abandoned warehouse on the south side of the city, and he's been planning something that would have put you in serious danger. Sarah set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. What kind of plan? He was preparing to kidnap you, Adrian replied matter-of-factly. He had rope, drugs to sedate you, and what appeared to be supplies for an extended captivity. He also had weapons, which suggests he was prepared to eliminate anyone who tried to stop him. The blood drained from Sarah's face as she realized how close she had come to a fate worse than death. What happens now? Now learns that actions have consequences, Adrian said, his blue eyes taking on an almost predatory gleam. I'm going to pay him a visit tonight, and you're going to be free to return to your life without fear. I don't want you to get in trouble because of me, Sarah said, though she couldn't deny the relief she felt at the prospect of being free from threats. Adrian reached across the table and took her hand in his. His skin was surprisingly cold, and Sarah noticed that his grip was much stronger than it appeared. Sarah, there are things about me that you don't understand yet. I'm not someone who gets in trouble, I'm someone who solves trouble. Threatened you, which means he threatened something that's under my protection. That makes this personal. There was something in Adrian's voice and manner that made Sarah believe he was far more dangerous than could ever be. But instead of frightening her, this knowledge filled her with hope for the first time in months. That evening, Adrian prepared to leave his estate with several companions who Sarah glimpsed only briefly. They were all tall, elegant people dressed in dark clothing, moving with the same fluid grace that she had noticed in Adrian. There was something otherworldly about all of them, as if they belonged to a different species entirely. "Stay in the house tonight," Adrian instructed Sarah before departing. "My staff will take care of anything you need, but don't go outside for any reason." "Will I see you again?" Sarah asked, suddenly afraid that Adrian might disappear from her life as mysteriously as he had entered it. Adrian paused in the doorway, his expression softening. "Sarah, you'll see me again very soon, and when you do, you'll be free to make choices about your life without fear or coercion from anyone." After Adrian left, Sarah tried to distract herself by exploring more of the house. She discovered a library filled with books in multiple languages, many of which appeared to be ancient manuscripts and historical texts. There were also numerous volumes about mythology, folklore, and subjects that seemed to focus on supernatural creatures and legends. One book in particular caught her attention, a leather-bound journal written in English that appeared to document the activities of Adrian's family over several centuries. As Sarah read, she began to understand that the Blackwood family had a long history of protecting innocent people from various threats, though their methods were often unconventional, and their true nature was carefully hidden from the outside world. The journal contained references to creatures and abilities that Sarah would have dismissed as fantasy under normal circumstances, but given everything she had experienced with Adrian, she found herself believing what she read. The Blackwood family were not ordinary humans, and their power to protect those under their care went far beyond wealth and influence. Meanwhile, across the city, was about to have the most terrifying night of his life. He had been hiding in the abandoned warehouse for over a week, planning his final assault on Sarah's independence. In his delusional mind, once he had her captive, he would be able to make her understand how much he loved her and convince her to accept their destiny together. Had managed to discover Sarah's hotel through a combination of surveillance and bribes paid to various service workers around the city. He had been planning to grab her in the hotel parking garage the following evening, but those plans were interrupted when his warehouse suddenly filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source. At first, thought he was experiencing some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But when Adrian Blackwood stepped out of the shadows, accompanied by several companions whose eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, realized he was facing something far beyond his understanding. Adrian said in a voice that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once, "You've been making threats against someone who is under my protection." Grabbed the gun he had purchased illegally and pointed it at Adrian with shaking hands. "Get away from me. Sarah belongs to me. I found her first." Adrian smiled, revealing teeth that seemed longer and sharper than they had any right to be. "Sarah belongs to herself, but you now belong to me." What happened next would have broken sanity if he had possessed any to begin with. Adrian moved faster than human eyes could follow, covering the distance between them in the blink of an eye. His gun was crushed in Adrian's grip as easily as if it had been made of paper, and found himself lifted off the ground by a strength that explanation. "You told Detective that Sarah would never escape you," Adrian said, his voice now carrying an inhuman resonance that seemed to vibrate through his bones. "You were wrong about that, but you were right about one thing: you always get what's yours. And what's yours is a lesson in what happens when someone threatens what belongs to me." Tried to scream, but no sound came from his throat. He was staring into Adrian's eyes, which had become something that no human eyes should ever become: ancient, predatory, and filled with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "I am Adrian Blackwood," the figure holding announced, though his voice now seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I am the king of the Pacific Northwest Territory, and Sarah Martinez is under my personal protection. Your threats against her constitute a challenge to my authority, and such challenges require decisive responses." His last coherent thought before his mind shattered completely was the realization that he had stumbled into a world that existed parallel to the human realm he thought he knew. He had threatened someone who was protected by creatures that made his own monstrosity seem insignificant by comparison. The confrontation in the warehouse was swift and final. Who had terrorized Sarah for months and threatened to never let her escape, learned that there were predators in the world far more dangerous than he could ever be. And more importantly, he learned that some prey comes with protectors who don't hesitate to eliminate threats permanently. When Adrian returned to his estate near dawn, Sarah was waiting for him in the library. She could see in his face that her nightmare was finally over, though she sensed there were details about's fate that she would never know and didn't want to learn. "It's finished," Adrian told her simply. "We'll never threaten you or anyone else again." Sarah nodded, accepting this news with a mixture of relief and understanding that her life had been saved by someone who operated by rules very different from those of the ordinary world. "What happens now?" "Now you're free," Adrian replied. "You can return to your apartment, your job, your normal life. The only question is whether you want that life to include me in it." Sarah looked into Adrian's blue eyes, seeing in them both the gentleness he had shown her and the terrible power he had used to destroy her tormentor. She understood that she was being offered a choice that would determine not just her immediate future, but the entire course of her existence. "I don't even know what you really are," Sarah said quietly. "No," Adrian agreed, "but you know who I am, and you know that I would never hurt you or allow anyone else to hurt you ever again." As the sun rose over Seattle, Sarah Martinez stood at a crossroads between the ordinary world where she had been a victim and an extraordinary realm where she could be protected by someone who had just proven his devotion in the most decisive way possible. Her stalker's threats had led her to discover that monsters were real, but so were the guardians who fought against them. The choice she made in that library would determine whether she returned to the safety of the familiar or embraced a destiny she was only beginning to understand. But for the first time in months, it was truly her choice to make, free from fear and coercion. Had promised that she would never escape him, but he had been wrong about that, just as he had been wrong about so many other things. Sarah was free, and the question now was what she would do with that freedom. Sarah Martinez stared out the library window as dawn broke over Seattle, her mind racing with questions she wasn't sure she was ready to have answered. In the space of a single night, her life had been transformed from a nightmare of constant fear into something she couldn't quite comprehend. The man who had terrorized her for months and promised she would never escape him was gone, but in his place was a mystery that seemed equally life-changing, if infinitely more appealing. Adrian Blackwood sat across from her in a leather chair that looked like it had been crafted centuries ago, his presence both comforting and slightly overwhelming. In the morning light filtering through the tall windows, Sarah could see him more clearly than ever before. His features were aristocratic and perfect in a way that didn't seem entirely human, and there was an ageless quality to his eyes that suggested he had seen far more of the world than his apparent age would indicate. "You have questions," Adrian said, his voice gentle but tinged with an authority that reminded Sarah of how he had spoken to in whatever confrontation had ended her stalker's threats forever. "I have 1,000 questions," Sarah admitted, "but I'm not sure I'm ready for the answers." Adrian leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see directly into her soul. "What are you ready for, Sarah?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond simple curiosity. Sarah understood that this was the moment when she would have to decide what direction her life would take. She could ask Adrian to drive her back to her hotel, return to her apartment, and pretend that none of this had ever happened. Or she could acknowledge that her life had already been changed irreversibly and embrace whatever came next. "I'm ready to understand what you are," Sarah said finally, "and I'm ready to know what it means that I'm under your protection." Adrian smiled, and Sarah noticed again how his teeth seemed slightly different from normal human teeth, not dramatically so, but enough to suggest that her instincts about his true nature were correct. "What I am is complicated," Adrian began, rising from his chair and walking to one of the tall that lined the library walls. "My kind has many names throughout history. Some cultures called us vampires, others referred to us as the undead, and still others simply called us nightwalkers. But those are human terms for something that transcends human understanding." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat, but surprisingly, she wasn't afraid. After everything she had experienced with very human monstrosity, the revelation that Adrian was something supernatural felt almost reassuring. "How old are you?" "I was born in 1847, Adrian replied matter-of-factly. "I was turned when I was 32 years old, which means I've been walking this earth for almost 2 centuries. "Turned by whom?" "By someone who recognized that I had the strength and moral character necessary to protect innocent people from predators like," Adrian explained. "My maker saw in me the potential to become what I am now, a king among my kind, responsible for maintaining order and protecting those who cannot protect themselves." Sarah processed this information with surprising calm. Perhaps months of living in fear had prepared her for revelations that would have seemed impossible under normal circumstances. Is that why you were at the support group, to find people who needed protection? Partly, Adrian admitted. I attend those sessions to understand the psychology of both predators and their victims. It helps me identify situations where conventional law enforcement is inadequate and more direct intervention is necessary. More direct intervention, Sarah repeated, like what happened to. Adrian's expression grew serious. Was given every opportunity to respect boundaries and obey the law. He chose to escalate his behavior to the point where he became a lethal threat. In my world, such threats are eliminated permanently. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where she had lived in fear for so many months. From Adrian's estate, Seattle looked peaceful and manageable, as if all its dangers could be controlled by someone with enough power and determination. What does it mean that I'm under your protection? She asked without turning around. It means that no one will ever terrorize you the way did, Adrian replied, moving to stand behind her. Sarah could feel his presence like a warm shadow, comforting rather than threatening. It means that you can live your life freely, pursue your goals, and make your own choices without fear of predators who think they can claim you. And in return, there is no in return, Adrian said firmly. My protection is not conditional on your reciprocation. You owe me nothing, Sarah. Your freedom is its own reward. Sarah turned to face him, studying his features in the morning light. Despite everything she had learned about his true nature, she felt safer in his presence than she had felt anywhere else since harassment began. But there could be something in return if I chose it, she said carefully. Adrian's expression became unreadable. What are you asking, Sarah? I'm asking what would happen if I didn't want to go back to my old life, if I wanted to stay here and learn more about your world. That would be complicated, Adrian admitted. My world is dangerous, even for those under my protection. The supernatural community has its own politics, rivalries, and conflicts that make human problems seem simple by comparison. More dangerous than being stalked by someone who planned to kidnap and probably kill me. Adrian conceded the point with a slight nod. Perhaps not more dangerous, but dangerous in different ways. And if you chose to become part of my world, there would eventually come a time when you would have to decide whether you wanted to remain human or become something else. The implications of this statement hung between them like a bridge that Sarah could choose to cross or ignore. She understood that Adrian was offering her something far more significant than protection. He was offering her a chance to become part of whatever supernatural realm he inhabited. Would I have to decide now? No, Adrian assured her. That choice could wait years or even decades. For now, you would simply be someone under my protection who chose to live within my household and learn about my world gradually. Sarah considered this option, weighing it against the alternative of returning to her apartment and pretending that her life could ever be normal again. The truth was that stalking had already changed her irrevocably. She would never again be the carefree woman who had once walked through Seattle without constantly looking over her shoulder. If I stayed, what would my life be like? You would continue working as a graphic designer or pursue any other career that interested you, Adrian explained. You would have your own space within my home, complete privacy when you desired it, and the freedom to come and go as you pleased. The only difference would be that you would always be protected, and you would gradually learn about aspects of the world that most humans never discover. What about relationships, romance? Adrian's expression became carefully neutral. You would be free to pursue any relationships that made you happy, as long as your partners understood and respected certain boundaries necessary for your safety. Sarah detected something in his tone that suggested this answer was more complicated than he was making it sound, but she decided not to press the issue at the moment. I need some time to think about this, she said. Of course, Adrian agreed. Take as much time as you need. In the meanwhile, you're welcome to stay here as long as you like. Over the next few days, Sarah experienced what it was like to live without fear for the first time in months. She could walk through Adrian's estate without constantly checking for threats, sleep without nightmares about breaking into her room, and focus on activities she enjoyed rather than constantly planning escape routes and safety measures. Adrian's household staff were discreet and professional, caring for Sarah's needs without being intrusive. She noticed that all of them moved with the same fluid grace that she had observed in Adrian, and she suspected that they were also supernatural beings of some kind. But they treated her with respect and kindness, making her feel like a welcomed guest rather than an outsider. Sarah also discovered that Adrian had been true to his word about her freedom to continue her normal life. Her boss at the marketing firm had been told that she was taking a temporary leave of absence due to safety concerns related to stalking, and her apartment had been cleaned and repaired at Adrian's expense. She could return to her job and her old life whenever she chose to do so. But as the days passed, Sarah found herself less and less interested in returning to the world she had known before harassment began. That life now seemed small and limiting compared to the possibilities that Adrian's world offered. She was also becoming increasingly aware of her growing feelings for Adrian himself. Despite his supernatural nature, or perhaps because of it, Adrian was the most fascinating person Sarah had ever met. He was cultured and intelligent, having lived through nearly 2 centuries of history and accumulated knowledge that no normal human could possess. He was also protective and considerate, treating her with a respect and care that made obsessive attention seem even more grotesque by comparison. Most importantly, Adrian had proven that he would go to extraordinary lengths to ensure her safety and freedom. The knowledge that someone so powerful was dedicated to her protection gave Sarah a sense of security she had never experienced before. On Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after his disappearance, Sarah made her decision. She found Adrian in his study, reading what appeared to be a very old book written in a language she didn't recognize. "I want to stay," she said without preamble. Adrian looked up from his book, his blue eyes searching her face. "Are you certain? This decision will change your life in ways you can't fully understand yet." "My life has already been changed," Sarah replied. "Changed it when he decided to stalk me, and you changed it when you protected me from him. I can't go back to being the person I was before all this happened, and I don't want to." Adrian set his book aside and gave her his full attention. "What do you want, Sarah?" "I want to learn about your world," Sarah said. "I want to understand what it means to be under the protection of a vampire king, and I want to see where this connection between us leads." "It could lead to dangerous places," Adrian warned. "My world has enemies who wouldn't hesitate to use you against me if they discovered how much you mean to me." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat at his words. "How much do I mean to you?" Adrian stood up and walked over to where she was standing, stopping just close enough that she could feel the coolness of his skin and catch that mysterious scent she had noticed before. "More than I expected," he admitted. "More than is probably wise for someone in my position." "What position is that?" "I am responsible for maintaining order among the supernatural creatures in this region," Adrian explained. "I have enemies who would love to find a weakness they could exploit. Caring about someone makes that person a potential target." Sarah reached up and touched Adrian's face, marveling at how his skin felt like cool marble beneath her fingers. "Then we'll just have to make sure I'm not a weakness. We'll have to make sure I'm strong enough to be an asset instead of a liability." Adrian caught her hand in his grip strong but gentle. "That would require you to eventually become like me, Sarah. Are you prepared for what that would mean?" "I'm prepared to learn what it would mean," Sarah replied. "And when I understand the full implications, I'll make an informed decision." Adrian studied her face for a long moment, then slowly smiled. "Very well, but we'll take this slowly. You have years to decide about the ultimate choice, and I want you to be completely certain before you commit to something that can't be undone." That night, Sarah moved her belongings from the guest room to a suite of rooms on the same floor as Adrian's personal chambers. It was a symbolic gesture that marked her transition from protected refugee to willing member of Adrian's supernatural household. As she settled into her new life, Sarah began to understand what Adrian had meant about the complexity of his world. She learned that Seattle was home to dozens of supernatural beings, vampires, werewolves, fey creatures, and others whose existence was carefully hidden from the human population. Adrian, as the vampire king of the Pacific Northwest, was responsible for maintaining peace between these various factions and ensuring that their activities didn't attract unwanted human attention. This responsibility occasionally required him to make difficult decisions and take actions that were necessary but not always pleasant. Sarah came to understand that's fate, while final, had been relatively merciful compared to what happened to supernatural beings who violated Adrian's rules or threatened the safety of innocents under his protection. But Sarah also discovered that Adrian's power came with genuine concern for justice and protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. He used his influence and resources to help victims of human predators as well as supernatural threats, working behind the scenes to ensure that people faced consequences, even when the conventional legal system failed. 3 months after his disappearance, Detective closed the stalking case, had vanished completely, leaving behind no trace of his whereabouts or plans. The official assumption was that he had fled the state to avoid prosecution, though Detective privately suspected that had met with some form of permanent justice. Sarah returned to work at the marketing firm, but her colleagues noticed that she seemed different, more confident, more secure, and somehow more sophisticated than before. She excelled in her position, perhaps because she was no longer distracted by constant fear and could focus entirely on her creative projects. Her relationship with Adrian developed slowly and naturally. They spent evenings talking about history, literature, and philosophy, with Adrian sharing stories from his long life and Sarah offering her perspective on modern human culture and values. They attended cultural events together, traveled to interesting places, and gradually became partners in every sense of the word except the most intimate. The physical aspect of their relationship remained carefully controlled, partly because of Adrian's supernatural nature, and partly because both of them understood that complete intimacy would represent a point of no return in their commitment to each other. 6 months after his disappearance, Sarah finally asked Adrian directly what had happened to her former stalker. "He's gone," Adrian replied simply, "permanently and completely." "Did you kill him?" "I eliminated a threat to someone under my protection," Adrian answered. "Made his choices, and I responded to those choices in a way that ensured he would never harm you or anyone else." Sarah nodded, accepting this explanation without requesting additional details. She had come to understand that some aspects of Adrian's world were better left unexplored in depth. "Do you regret what happened to him?" Adrian asked. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "I regret that couldn't find help for whatever was wrong with him before he became dangerous, but I don't regret that he can never terrorize anyone else the way he terrorized me." "And you don't regret meeting me through those circumstances?" "Never," Sarah said firmly. "Brought fear and misery into my life, but that experience also led me to you, and you brought me safety, respect, and a kind of love I never thought I would find." A year after threats had brought them together, Adrian proposed to Sarah in the library where she had first learned the truth about his nature. The engagement ring was an antique that had belonged to his family for generations, and Sarah understood that accepting it meant accepting a future that would eventually include her transformation into something beyond human. They were married 6 months later in a ceremony that was attended by beings from throughout the supernatural community, as well as Sarah's human family and friends who believed they were simply witnessing an unusual but perfectly normal wedding. Sarah's sister Emma served as her maid of honor, and during the reception she pulled Sarah aside with questions about her new husband. "There's something different about Adrian and his friends," Emma observed. "They're all so elegant and sophisticated, but there's something almost otherworldly about them." "Adrian comes from a very old family with traditional ways," Sarah replied diplomatically. "They do things differently than most people." "Well, whatever his background is, I've never seen you happier or more confident," Emma said. "Really did a number on you, but Adrian has somehow made you stronger than you were before any of this happened." Emma was more right than she knew. Sarah had not only recovered from her stalking trauma, but had discovered reserves of strength and courage she had never known she possessed. Living in Adrian's world had taught her that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. 2 years after their marriage, Sarah made the decision that both she and Adrian had known was inevitable from the beginning. She chose to undergo the transformation that would make her like him, immortal, powerful, and capable of standing beside him as an equal partner in ruling their supernatural territory. The transformation was conducted in the same library where Sarah had first learned the truth about Adrian's nature. It was a ceremony as old as vampire society itself, witnessed by the most senior members of Adrian's circle and marking Sarah's transition from protected human to supernatural royalty. When Sarah awakened from the transformation 3 days later, she discovered that her new vampire nature had enhanced not only her physical capabilities, but also her mental and emotional strength. She was now truly Adrian's equal, capable of sharing in both the responsibilities and privileges of his position as king of the Pacific Northwest supernatural community. The first thing Sarah did with her new abilities was to research the fates of other women who had been terrorized by stalkers like. Working with Adrian, she established a network of protection and intervention that helped victims of persistent harassment when conventional law enforcement proved inadequate. Their organization, operating entirely behind the scenes, provided resources, security, and when necessary, permanent solutions for victims who had exhausted all legal options. Sarah's experience gave her unique insight into the psychology of both stalkers and their victims, making her exceptionally effective at identifying situations that required supernatural intervention. 5 years after had promised that Sarah would never escape him, she stood on the balcony of Adrian's estate looking out over a city where she had once lived in constant fear. Now, she was one of the most powerful supernatural beings in the Pacific Northwest, partner to a king, and protector of countless innocent people who would never know how close they had come to becoming victims. Had been wrong about Sarah never escaping him, but he had been inadvertently right about one thing. She had indeed become someone else's permanent possession. But unlike's twisted concept of ownership, Adrian's love was based on respect, protection, and the recognition of Sarah's own strength and worth. Sarah Martinez had survived a nightmare that could have destroyed her, emerged stronger than ever, and found a love that transcended the boundaries between human and supernatural worlds. Her stalker had promised she would never be free, but instead his threats had led her to a freedom more complete than anything she had ever imagined possible. The woman who had once cowered in hotel rooms and jumped at unexpected sounds was now someone who could walk through the darkest parts of the city without fear, knowing that she had both the power to protect herself and a partner who would move heaven and earth to ensure her safety. His final threat, that Sarah would never escape him, had become the catalyst for her transformation into something far beyond his worst nightmares. In trying to make her his prisoner, he had inadvertently delivered her to someone who would make her a queen. And in the end, Sarah Martinez had indeed never escaped the events that set in motion. But instead of becoming his captive, she had become the protector of others who faced similar threats, ensuring that his legacy would be the liberation of countless victims who might otherwise have suffered as she once had. The Vampire King had kept his promise. Sarah was free, was gone, and justice had been served in a way that transcended anything the human legal system could have provided. Sometimes the most unlikely salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the defeat of monsters who never understood that their prey was destined for something far greater than they could comprehend.